Welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you join us today for the release of our new survey, Democracy at a Crossroads, How Americans View Trump's First 100 Days in Office. I want to first begin by introducing our panelists, but to let you know, after the introductions, we're going to have Robert P. Jones, our president and founder, go over the findings. We want you to submit questions in the Q&A box. We're going to try our best to get to as many questions as we can by the end of the webinar. So first, let's start with some introductions. We are delighted to be joined by both Joy Reid and Sarah McCammon today to offer their commentary about today's survey reports. Joy, of course, is formerly the host of The Readout on MSNBC. She is also a book writer and documentary producer, and she's the author of the upcoming book Medgar and Murley and the co-director of the upcoming film The Conspiracy to Kill Medgar Evans. You can find her writing, her political analysis, numerous media appearances on her Substack at Joy's House. You can find that at www.joyandreid.com. Sarah McCammon is a national political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. She is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Ex-Evangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. You can also find her writing on her Substack, Off the Air, A Journalist After Hours Thoughts. That's a pretty juicy title for a Substack, Sarah, so please tune in there and read her writing. And finally, last but certainly not least, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Robert P. Jones. He's the president and founder of PRRI. He's the author of multiple books, award-winning books, but most recently of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. He writes regularly at his Substack, White Too Long. This newsletter features breaking research and insights related to religion, white Christian nationalism, and protecting a pluralistic democracy. I should also introduce myself. I'm Dr. Melissa Deckman, the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, and I've been writing a lot about gender, Gen Z, and religion throughout my career. So including my most recent book, The Politics of Gen Z, which appeared last fall with Columbia University Press. So without further ado, I'm actually going to give the reins over to Robbie, who's going to provide us with a fantastic overview of some of the highlights from our survey. Robbie.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Melissa. And thank you, Joy. And thank you, Sarah, for being here. So my job is really to set the table with the main findings of the survey. I'm going to share my screen now to kind of go over the main findings, and then we will hand it over to Joy and to Sarah for some commentary. And again, just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A box so we can go ahead and have those ready to go when we get ready to turn to your questions. All right, here we go. We're entitling this report Democracy at a Crossroads. This is PRI's first survey post-inauguration and taking the temperature of Americans' attitudes across a whole range of issues. I'm only going to be able to really scratch the surface in this PowerPoint presentation. We have like a nearly 40-page report with nearly 30 charts in it on the PRRI website at prri.org. So please do go over there. We'll also make these slides available in addition to the report there as well. So with that, we are going to jump in. So the first thing to mention is this is a very large survey. It's over 5,000 interviews with a random probability sample of Americans. The other thing to say is that we were out of the field on March 20th. So whatever attitudes you're seeing here haven't even registered the post-tariff realities that have set in. So this is in the field through March 20th. Here. The margin of error is plus or minus about 1.7 percentage points. So first, let me jump off here. We asked about voter remorse. Turns out that most Americans are actually quite satisfied with their vote. So here it looks like Trump supporters, Harris supporters, either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied, nearly all of them. The main place we really see is a little drop off is among people who voted for another candidate or people who did not vote here. And we certainly see a significant number of non-voters in particularly, in fact, nearly a third of them saying that they are regretful of their vote. But among partisans, people who voted for Trump, people who voted for Harris, it's single digits saying that they regretted their vote. Again, a little bit more for third party, but a lot for people who did not vote in the 2024 election. We are finding, consistent with a lot of other polling, the job approval underwater here, 43% overall as president. Highest on handling immigration and reaches nearly half approval, but on handling the economy, and again, this is before the tariffs kind of all hit, 41%. 41% on Russia's war with Ukraine. But you can see these huge partisan divides. So even though that's where the country is, Republicans, for the most part, still hanging in there with him. But when you put independents and Democrats down, you really do see the differences here. I just want to flag independents on the economy. Only 36% of independents approving of Trump support on the economy, and that's 82% of Republicans, but only 36% of independents saying they support his handling of the economy. That's not good. 100 days in. So Trump favorability over time, this is, we've been tracking this all the way back. So looking back before he was elected, first term, into his first term, not a lot of variation, really in the low 40s. And this is favorability, not job approval. So favorable views of Trump, we've tracked through even through Biden's term, a little bit lower actually at 40% now. But you can see the big partisan divides here. Largely Republicans still holding a very strongly favorable view of Trump. Democrats way down in single digits. Again, I'll point to independents though. Only 35% favorable view of Trump among independents here. Much closer, in fact, to the way Democrats are viewing Trump than the way that Republicans are viewing Trump at this point. So on the religious front, again, here's all Americans' favorable views of Trump. We notice a big divide, and we've talked about this a lot at PRRI, but this is a kind of ethno-religious divide with white Christian groups being much more favorable toward Trump than non-white Christian groups and other religions and the unaffiliated on the other hand. And here's what we see. So the groups who have majority favorable views of Trump: white evangelicals, white Catholics, white non-evangelicals, that's called the main line, Latter-day Saints, and then there's the All-Americans number, and then it just drops off, right? Here are all the other kind of major religious groups that we can break out. The ones I will really point here to are Latinos, Latino Protestants, Latino Catholics, down a third of Latino Protestants. That group, by the way, I should just point out, voted about 6 in 10 for President Trump in the election, and now their favorability is down at 32%. Hispanic Catholics down at 25% favorability. So again, the big divide between kind of white Christian groups and pretty much everyone else on favorability with Trump. I mentioned Latino Protestants, but this drop in favorability, and again, if we just go back to fall pre-election numbers, and look at Trump favorability among Latinos, we see this drop among all Latinos from 39% down to 27% in this latest poll. The numbers are the biggest, actually. The drop is the biggest among Latino Protestants. They're also significant among Latino Catholics. Latino unaffiliated were fairly low before and basically haven't significantly moved. But this nearly 20-point drop among Latino Protestants, again, a group that voted for President Trump in the last election, that's really important and significant for us to watch. We also asked a unique question where we gave people two different questions and said, which one of these do you most agree with? We try to kind of give two very strong versions of the question. One, President Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy, or President Trump is a strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore American greatness. And then we allow people to either agree or strongly agree with the one that they picked. We found in this survey that we actually have a slim majority, 52% of the country, saying they either strongly agree or agree with that first statement, that Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy. And we have 44% picking the other side, that Trump is a strong leader, should be given the power he needs to restore American greatness. If you look at the partisan divide, there are no real surprises that it's huge on this statement, but we still have notably 17% of Republicans saying that they are concerned that President Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited. It's overwhelming numbers of Democrats saying that, but it's also, I should point out, 56% of independents saying this, actually a little more than the kind of 52% of all Americans among independents. So they're the other side of the equation. You can see Republicans still largely locked in, strongly agreeing he's a leader, should be given the power he needs, but looking very different than independents or Democrats on this question. Similar look at religious groups here. You can see it's the same break. It's kind of that we saw in favorability. It is white Christian groups largely saying he should be given the power he needs, but it is everyone else in majority territory saying he's a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited. Again, notably including 58% of Latino Protestants, a group that voted for him, saying that he is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited. But white Christian groups largely there with majorities saying no, he's a strong leader, should be given the power that he needs. So that divide's very big. One other thing to point out here is these are people, this is the views on that question among people who say they regretted their vote decision. So among Trump voters who regretted their vote decision, we have a majority of that group saying they believe Trump is a dangerous dictator. And among non-voters who regretted not voting, again, even stronger, 58% saying they believe Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited. And there's the other side of that question. We also have some questions about expanding executive power in a number of ways. One of these was about whether Trump should postpone the 2026 midterm elections if we can't get the country out of crisis. The other one is about a third term, as we have seen and NPR and others have covered. There's already, the Trump campaign's already selling hats with the next term on the hats. But when we ask people about either of these things, we find very few Americans, 17% actually both. Only 17% say that Trump should be able to postpone the 2026 midterm elections, or that the Constitution should be amended to allow presidents to serve more than 2 terms in office. There are some partisan divides on the constitutional amendment question to allow Trump to serve 2 terms in office. But interestingly enough, really no partisan breaks to speak of here on the question of being able to postpone the 2026 midterm elections. But there are about nearly 3 in 10 Republicans who say they would support amending the Constitution to allow a president that would include Trump to serve more than 2 terms in office. Other kinds of expansions of executive power here we asked about. Here's 3. When Congress or the Supreme Court hold our country back, the president should be able to ignore them. So ignoring checks and balances from the other branches of government. The second one, agreeing that we need a president who is willing to break some laws if that's what it takes to set things right. And then the last one, disagreeing with the idea that no elected official, including the president, should be above the law. As you can see, overall, very few Americans kind of on board with these sentiments, but we do see some differences on the first 2 among Republicans, with nearly 3 in 10 Republicans saying the president should be able to ignore Congress or the Supreme Court, and nearly 3 in 10 Republicans saying we need a president who may be willing to break some laws if that's what it takes to set things right. But overall, on the president being above the law, very, very few takers and very few partisan differences on that question as well. We also ask about a range of executive orders here. There are 5 here. I'll hit them very quickly. This is the full question wording here. One is the establishment of a federal task force, that anti-Christian bias task force focuses exclusively on Christians. The second one, closing or drastically shrinking all major federal agencies. The third one, implementing new tariffs or taxes on important goods. The next one is favoring the Constitution's existing guarantee that all children born in the U.S. Are automatically citizens, so birthright citizenship. And finally, agreeing that President Trump has overstepped his authority. So if we look at the first one, the establishment of federal, this is opposing the anti-Christian bias task force. and rather than having one that focuses on discrimination against all religions. It's 78% of all Americans. It's actually even 66% of Republicans. I don't have all the party breaks here, just giving Republicans so you can see the contrast between all Americans and Republicans. But interestingly enough, two-thirds of Republicans opposing that idea. Now, when we get to kind of opposing the drastic shrinking of all federal agencies, it's 71% of the country, but only about half of Republicans. On tariffs, it is two-thirds opposing tariffs. It's two-thirds of the country, but only one-third of Republicans opposing tariffs. On birthright citizenship, favoring that, it's two-thirds of the country favoring birthright citizenship, but less than half of Republicans favoring that. And then the belief that President Trump has overstepped his authority, it's a majority of Americans, but only a little more than a quarter of Republicans. So agreement of Republicans about this anti-Christian bias, kind of opposing that idea rather than having one that focuses on all, but big divides between Republicans and the rest of the country everywhere else. And one I'll break out here just in religious terms, this establishment of a federal task force focusing exclusively on discrimination against Christians. Again, it's 78% opposing that here. And interestingly enough, all the way across the board, even white evangelical Protestants, who are, of course, President Trump's strongest supporters, two-thirds of them oppose the idea of having it just focused on Christians rather than all religions. So Elon Musk, opposition to his role in the federal government. Let's kind of take these one at a time. So two-thirds of the country oppose allowing Elon Musk to access private data about American citizens at agencies such as the IRS or Social Security, but only 4 in 10 Republicans oppose that. We've also find 6 in 10 Americans disapprove of the job Elon Musk is doing with the federal government, but only 21% of Republicans. Similarly, we find 58% have an unfavorable view of Musk, but only about a quarter of Republicans. And then finally, we have a majority agreeing that Elon Musk's attempts to find waste and fraud are reckless and are doing more harm than good, but only 22% of Republicans on that question as well. And then finally, the last little section here, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists for some comments. We tried to get underneath immigration and pluralism and some of those ideas here. This is one on views of immigrants and immigrant policy. The first one is a kind of percentage agreed the federal government should place immigrants who are in the country illegally in internment camps guarded by the U.S. military until they can be deported. So fairly extreme policy, but one we've heard floated. About a third of Americans agree with that. And then this idea that sometimes gets dubbed the so-called Great Replacement Theory, this idea that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. Only about a third of Americans agreeing with that as well. But look at the partisan breaks on this. They're really huge. So it's 6 in 10 Republicans agreeing with both of these things, including setting up of internment camps guarded by the U.S. military for mass deportations, and agreeing with the idea that immigrants are invading the country, but independents and Democrats in very, very different places here. And you can see that, again, this is kind of asymmetric polarization where independents are much closer to the views of the country and Democrats than Republicans. Republicans really standing out from both groups there. We also asked a question about whether people think discrimination against either Christians or white Americans, we ask it in 2 separate questions, but we get them both here on the same chart, has become as big a problem as discrimination against other groups. Among all Americans, it's less than 4 in 10 who agree with that statement. But among white evangelical Protestants, it is a 2/3 or 6 in 10, 2/3 saying that discrimination against Christians has become as big a problem as discrimination against other groups. 6 in 10 saying discrimination against white Americans has become as big a problem as discrimination against other groups. And then here is as everyone else. You can see that white evangelicals really stand out, particularly on the Christian question, even among other Christian groups. They're the only group that believes that discrimination against Christians has become as big a problem as discrimination against other groups. On the question of whether white Americans, kind of discrimination against white Americans is as big a problem, it's really only Latter-day Saints or Mormons and white evangelicals who have a majority. Everybody else below majority on that question. And then on DEI and questions about diversity and perceptions of diversity, we had a question where we asked people whether they agreed whether increasing diversity almost almost always either comes at the expense of white people or strengthens an organization's workforce. Here is statement one, agreement with statement one, always comes at the expense of white people. Republicans, again, in a very different place than the country, only 4 in 10 Americans, but it is nearly 2/3 of Republicans who agree with that. It's independents and Democrats, far below majority there. And there's the other side of that, where you can see only about a third of Republicans believing that efforts to increase diversity strengthens an organization's workforce. Here we ask people about their perception of what kind of a country they want to live in. And there's actually some good news here about kind of support for pluralism in the country. And we asked them, do you want to prefer the U.S. to be a nation made up of either, on the left side, people belonging to a wide variety of religions? The other side of that question is, or people who are members of the Christian faith. And then, do we want to live in a nation made of people from all over the world? And the other side of that question was, are people primarily from Western Europe? And even given those other options, we find vast majority of Americans want to live in a country of people belonging to a wide variety of religions and coming from all over the world. It's super majorities among Democrats and independents. It's a lower majority among Republicans on the religious side, but it's still a majority of Republicans saying that. However, we do see a little bit of a break here. We look at the views of religious groups. We're still majority across the board there, which is notably that we see this kind of majority on both of these sides too. Again, some good news there. The one exception here at the bottom is white evangelical Protestants. Only on the Christian side, white evangelical Protestants actually more divided about whether they want to live in a country that belongs to a wide variety of religions or is made up of people mostly of the Christian faith. But everybody else really for both religious and ethnic pluralism there. Lastly, and I'll leave on this, a lot of talk about what constitutes improper ideology. I'm speaking as someone whose own book got banned at the U.S. Naval Academy for supposedly improper ideology. My book, White Too Long. But when we ask Americans about this, about what we should be teaching on critical American history, they support teaching critical American history. So we gave people a choice. We should teach American history that, statement one, includes both our best achievement and our worst mistakes as a country, or we should teach American history that focuses only on what makes this country exceptional and great. It turns out it is overwhelming that the country, 3/4 of the country says the first one. We should teach American history that includes both our best achievements and our worst mistakes as a country. And in fact, there's actually strong majorities of Democrats, independents, and Republicans, 7 in 10 Republicans who say that. It's really only about 1 in 10 Republicans who say that we should focus only on what makes this country exceptional and great. So we should send that as a memo to the White House. So I will stop there, and we will hand this back over to Joy and Sarah. And again, put your questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah, and just to echo there, Robbie, thank you for that great presentation. Again, there's much more in our survey report. Please go online, find it, send it to your friends, promote it, all of that good stuff. So we want to start first with Joy for her comments, and then we'll go over to Sarah for her comments about the survey findings today. Joy.
Thank you so much. I just want to once again thank the Public Religion Research Institute. This is one of my favorite things to do every year, to listen to and go through Robbie's incredible presentation and data. I love me some data. So, as I was reading through this last night and going over it, what really struck me, not only and something that we find every year, is the relative isolation of Republicans versus everyone else, and the relative isolation of white evangelical Republicans in particular, and Latter-day Saints, Mormons, from everyone else when it comes to their opinions about the way America should be. But I'm struck even more in the wake of the burial over this past weekend of the People's Pope, of Pope Francis. And when we're sort of focusing on religion and on his version of religion, which was very focused and centered on the immigrant and on the poor. And, he named himself Pope Francis out of after St. Francis was the beacon to the poor. And his final message was about protecting and defending the immigrant and the needy. And yet, the people in this country, per these numbers, who most identify theoretically with evangelical Christianity, Christ, the term being the messenger, right, of Christianity, are the most opposed to immigration, to the extent that majorities of self-declared Christian nationalists and white evangelical Protestants, and white Christians in general would favor placing undocumented immigrants in concentration camps, believe that diversity is dangerous to the country, agree with great replacement theory, and also effectively want a dictator, want a king, a Herod for America. I find that incredibly ironic. That it feels like those who would have a Roman Empire in America are the very people who claim to identify most closely with Jesus. And I genuinely find that jarring. It is good to know that even a majority of Republicans do not want to technically live in North Korea, but I'm not sure how that data jibes with the idea that, 2/3 of Republicans saying that Donald Trump should be allowed to have all the power he needs to get the country in order and could necessarily postpone the midterm elections and serve an additional term, effectively becoming an American Herod, becoming an American Roman emperor. I find that was the thing I think that struck me the most. I also was struck by the decline in Hispanic Protestants and particularly Hispanic Catholics. Again, we just buried a Hispanic Catholic Pope. And the Latino drift toward Trump was in part, per a lot of the anecdotal evidence, based on their own opposition to undocumented immigrants, their own distancing of themselves from fellow immigrants, and their desire to see a harder line on immigration. Now what we've seen is, and I know this survey ended in mid-March, it was March 12th, I just quickly looked it up, when Kilmar Abrego Garcia was arrested and then, sent, essentially abducted to a foreign prison. And now what you're seeing is Latinos across this country being picked up, even if they're citizens, and either held and having their citizenship questioned, or in fact deported. We've just seen 3 Latino children, 7 years of age and under, one with cancer, deported, and they're all 3 birthright citizens. And this survey shows that a majority of white evangelicals oppose the idea of birthright citizenship, or at least question the notion of birthright citizenship, which would be, I think, a surprise to Jesus. Joseph having fled to Egypt to try to escape persecution and the potential killing of his child, and the 3 Abrahamic religions stemming from immigration. Abraham came from the land of Ur and traveled thousands of miles to the land of Canaan, where he was not from, and settled there on the orders of God. This is what Christians in theory believe. And I have to just say that it is shocking every time that we do these surveys and you see majorities of evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians, opposing all of the things that we grew up with. I grew up in the church. We understood to be Christianity. So I'll just leave it there.
Shall I just jump in?
Okay.
Well, I also want to thank you, Robbie and Melissa and PRRI more broadly for having me and for this really important and illuminating research. PRRI data has been so critical for my work over the years, both for NPR and in writing my book, and just so helpful in sort of rooting qualitative conversations and anecdotal observations in data. Particularly when it comes to the intersections of politics and religion. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity. I've been covering Trump and his coalition in some form for about a decade now, and a lot of my focus has been on religious conservatives, especially evangelical Christians. So I was struck but not exactly surprised by the extent to which white evangelicals have continued to stand behind Trump, even as other groups of Americans are raising alarms and describing him as a dangerous dictator in some cases. And as we just heard from Robbie, and as Joy noted a moment ago, white evangelicals are in many ways the outlier in supporting policies that are otherwise increasingly unpopular. Trump has majority support, as Robbie noted, only among white Christian groups, and the largest share of that is coming from white evangelicals, with about 3/4 continuing to back him, both in terms of favorability and job approval. Now, that's a slight dip compared to exit polls in November, but nonetheless very robust. And based on my reporting, I think that support is driven in large part by this sense among white evangelicals that Robbie identified, that we see in this polling, that Christians are facing discrimination. That perception and Trump's validation of that perception, I believe, helps to explain, in a large part, explain this robust and continued support. And I just want to tick through, some of the specifics in the poll. Close to 8 in 10 white evangelicals approve of Trump's handling of immigration. It's a much lower number that approve of the military encampments that Joy mentioned, 56%. But even there, white evangelicals are much more supportive of this idea than the general public, and are the only group that expresses majority support for this policy. So even when it comes to some of Trump's least popular ideas, white evangelicals remain largely in lockstep with him. And without them, I think it's important to note that his overall numbers would be much, much lower. Joy talked about sort of this Republicans as outliers, and that is true. And a lot of what's driving that polarization is white Christians and white evangelical Christians in particular. I will add, though, that I think that as journalists and pollsters, we should continue to give thought going forward to a broader definition, a broader group of religious conservatives. Religious conservatives in this country aren't limited to white evangelicals or even conservative Catholics. Robbie mentioned Latino Protestants as a group with a lot of volatility in terms of their opinion of Trump, and a big drop in support for Trump since the election. And I wholeheartedly agree that that is a critical group to watch, as well as other groups of diverse religious conservatives. I've been paying a lot of attention to this in my reporting since the election. I was fascinated by the exit polls and the extent to which Trump expanded his coalition to non-white voters. I think we've probably all seen this data. Trump actually lost ground with some groups of white voters compared to 2020, particularly college-educated women, even as he picked up support among Latinos, Asians, young Black men. So I've spent a lot of time since the election talking to people who represent or are part of those groups. And what I've heard from these are, non-white conservatives. I want to be sure to sort of highlight that. Sounds a lot like what I've heard from white evangelicals and other Christian conservatives over the years. Concerns about the economy, of course, but also culture war issues like abortion and transgender policy. I talked to Asian Americans in Nevada recently who feel that DEI programs are disadvantaging their children in applications for colleges and jobs. And so my takeaway from my reporting has been that at least as of November and right after the election, non-white voters with fiscally conservative instincts and socially conservative values have resonated with Trump's message in larger numbers than in the past. I also heard from Muslim voters in Michigan who talked about concerns about transgender rights policies that they said did not align with their religious beliefs. So I hear these groups of non-white voters sounding an awful lot like white evangelicals in some cases. And it seems to me from my reporting that Trump and the Republicans were very intentional about that kind of messaging. We saw this in some of the ad spending leading up to the election focused on transgender issues in particular. That said, I'm very curious to see to what extent that persists. And as we've discussed, at least with Latinos, some of that support appears to be substantially eroding so far. I think a lot will hinge on how Trump's economic policies play out over the long term, given how important voters across the board ranked the issue of the economy. Also, immigration policies can't be ignored. We've talked about that. And all of that said, I think this data is a reminder, though, of just how critical Trump's white evangelical base has been and continues to be for him. Even though white Christianity, including white evangelicalism, is on an overall downward trajectory, this is something that Robbie and PRRI have been tracking for a long time, white evangelical Christians remain the single most unified and durable voting bloc behind Donald Trump. And this poll demonstrates the relative unshakability of that support, even as his policies raise alarms with other groups. The other thing that stood out to me is the level of regret. Robbie touched on this at the beginning, not among voters so much, but among non-voters. The vast majority of Harris and Trump voters seem satisfied with their decision, even if some have concerns. Some Trump supporters have some concerns about his policies. But close to a third of people who didn't vote regret not doing so. And to me, that's another group to pay close attention to, because as we know, elections shift kind of on the margins. Finally, this poll aligns in a lot of ways with results from other pollsters this week, including, I feel contractually obligated to say, an NPR poll out today. 100 days in, President Trump and his policies are largely unpopular with most groups of Americans, and many Americans feel that he's going too far. So for me, in my reporting in the next couple of years, I think the big question will be, how does that matter? Will these numbers reshape the way that Trump governs? Will they motivate any pushback from his party? There are, of course, midterms coming up next year, and even though Trump won't be on the ballot, many of his fellow Republicans will. We know that Republicans don't have a long track record of pushing back on Trump, and those who do push back don't tend to have long careers in the party. But they have to be seeing these numbers and thinking about them as they look ahead to 2026. So it's still early. We are 100 days in, but it will be important to watch each of these subgroups of voters that we've talked about to see how they continue to respond to Trump and how Trump and other members of his party respond to public sentiment, and just how worried they are about consequences at the ballot box next year. So thank you.
Thank you, both Joy and Sarah, for those great comments. It's actually fitting that I'm following Sarah, because I really thought a lot about last November's elections when I read this survey and looked at these survey results in great detail. In many ways, I think I was going to title my comments as Back to the Future. So I want to actually revisit just a little bit Americans' vote choices in November, but also more importantly, I think what our survey tells us about what an electorate might look like in the future in 2026 and beyond. And so, of course, compared with 2016, Donald Trump did win the popular vote, and he made inroads with a surprising number of voting groups that had traditionally trended heavily Democratic. And so I think one result of last fall's election is that many pundits were saying we're finally witnessing the birth of a multiracial working class coalition within the Republican Party, one that also includes younger Americans, particularly young men. But I think that the survey results really cast doubt on whether we're seeing the emergence of this sustainable partisan realignment. If anything, I think our survey shows that if the administration continues along its current policy trajectory, those gains that the GOP made will really be largely in jeopardy. So just really quickly, I want to focus on three groups. If we look back at the electoral gains that Trump made, I'm here drawing primarily from the validated voter files. Those aren't eligible or ready yet for the public. But in 2020, 8% of African Americans voted for Donald Trump. We found in our post-election survey, which is available online if you want to take a closer look there, 17% of Black voters voted for Donald Trump, although I would point out that that was largely among Black men. We found, so for example, if you go back to 2020 among Hispanic voters, we talked a lot today in the survey about the shifting dynamics of Hispanic Americans. 36% voted for Trump. Our post-election survey found it was an outright majority, and even more so for Hispanic Protestants who, as Sarah noted, have trended more culturally conservative in lots of areas. We found in our post-election survey that it was 64% of Hispanic Protestants reported voting for Donald Trump. Trump also made gains with Catholics in 2024, but not nearly as high. And then, of course, younger voters, right? In 2020, only about 35% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted for Trump. Our post-election survey found that it was even. It was a rough split, 49 to 49. Of course, though, I should note that the gender gap is really large among young Gen Z or among Gen Z voters. 58% Gen Z men reported voting for Donald Trump compared to just 37% of Gen Z women. Okay, so why should we, however, think that this emerging coalition here, this new voting coalition, is in jeopardy? Well, I think you can look to lots of data in the survey. I just want to focus on a couple of quick points. Robbie went and looked at favorability ratings for Trump. I want to look at what Americans think about his job performance as president here. So we found that just 19% of African Americans approve of the job that Trump's doing. It's just 27% of Hispanics here. And again, remember, our data show that more than half voted for Donald Trump. And here, even among Hispanic Protestants, just 34% approve of Trump's job as president. And Trump is also way underwater with Gen Z voters as well. Just 37% of Gen Zers approve of the work of the job that Trump is doing. When we turn to specific policies and initiatives, for example, looking at Elon Musk, as Robbie showed in great detail, Elon Musk is not exactly popular with the American public, but just 14% of Black Americans approve of the job that Musk is doing within the federal government, followed by just a quarter of Hispanic Americans. Gen Z also not a fan of the work that Musk is doing with the federal government. Just a third of Gen Zers support that. We also, of course, talked a bit about DEI. As Robbie noted, a major priority of the Trump administration is to root out diversity, equality, inclusion, all areas, including banning books at military academies. But I think what's notable is that DEI is often more popular with the American public than is often assumed. Going back to that figure that Robbie included in the PowerPoint presentation, we found 54% of Americans, again, agree that efforts to increase diversity strengthen an organization's workforce. That number jumps up to 64% of Black Americans and 64% of Hispanic Americans, including 65% of Hispanic Protestants. And most Gen Zers, a solid majority, 57%, actually think that DEI efforts and actually strengthen a society in lots of ways. Finally, I want to talk about immigration. That's been mentioned a lot. Looking at our question about whether the federal government should intern, immigrants who are here illegally until they can be deported. We find just 25% of Black Americans and 20% of Hispanic Americans and just 27% of Gen Zers agree with that. And notably, we often are looking at ethno-religious divisions in our survey research routinely. I think it's notable that only 22% and 19%, respectively, of Hispanic Protestants and Catholics agree with this policy, and it's among the lowest groups of large religious groups in American society. So all of this is to say is that I think in looking at the future of the GOP, I don't think that the GOP is really going to be able to grow and diversify its political base. And I think especially with Hispanic Protestants, that's one thing that we were really struck with on our team is that we see Hispanic Protestants looking a lot more like Hispanic Catholics than their white evangelical counterparts by far. And that was a bit surprising. But at the same time, I think if you look at a lot of our survey research on immigration, I think we are an organization that has polled more widely about Americans' attitudes about immigrants and about policy. And from a religious angle, Hispanic Protestants have always been more favorable toward comprehensive immigration reform and hold more favorable views toward immigrants. And I do think that is an important factor in maybe explaining some of that shift. But last but not least, I think we have to get back to the economy. Our post-election survey asked Americans who voted for Trump why they cast their ballot for Donald Trump. And really, it was the economy, by and large, as the most important example. If Trump fails, frankly, to deliver on the economy and continues to enact these larger, more unpopular policies, I think the broadening of the GOP coalition is really short-lived. So, all right, on that note, we have lots of questions in our Q&A that I want to turn to and get some of our panelists' thoughts on. So one of the questions concerns DOGE, and now that Musk has stepped back from Joe's, there's a concern that our personal data has been compromised. Will that be used potentially in the 2026 election? So I just want to know, maybe from Joy and Sarah's reporting, what safeguards are in place for how can we protect our voting process in spite of all of these actions potentially? So I know what you're hearing on the ground with respect to voting, the security of vote, access to the ballot. Maybe share some of your thoughts. Maybe Joy and then Sarah.
Sure. And I will note, I'm trying to go through and find it really quickly here. I think in this survey, only 4 in 10 Republicans oppose Elon Musk having access to our personal data, which actually makes me very nervous that there's an openness to giving our personal data to Elon Musk and allowing him to access it. I think that the news here is not great. There's a full court press by Republicans in this juncture to secure their takeover of the federal government and state government simultaneously, and to do it in really aggressive ways. The SAVE Act being one of the most aggressive. The SAVE Act would make it much more difficult, particularly for women to vote, because it would, number one, it would, well, for two groups of people. One, it would require showing proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. And then secondly, it would require your birth certificate to match your voter registration. Well, if you've been married, your birth certificate obviously, and you've changed your name, your birth certificate obviously would not match. And so it will be difficult to match all of these pieces of identification if you've changed your name for any reason. And it is a very clear attempt to set up obstacles, particularly to women being able to vote, because we see that even among Republicans, even among Republican women, there's a smaller percentage of women who vote Republican than men. Even white women vote less Republican than white men. And so I think there is an aggressive attempt to do that. There's also no more effective enforcement of the Voting Rights Act inside of the Justice Department. They've withdrawn from all of the enforcement measures that the Biden administration and previously the Obama administration had begun and undertaken. So the Justice Department essentially has gotten out of the business of voter protection. They're also going after the mechanisms by which Democrats physically run for office. The DOJ's now sort of Eye of Sauron on Act Blue, which is by far the largest mechanism by which candidates raise money to vote in either party. There's a Republican version of Act Blue, but it has about 2/3 the fundraising strength that happens with Act Blue. So attempting to attack Act Blue would actually make it not just more difficult for people to run for Senate or for the House, but for any office, all the way down to city councils. So I think this multi-pronged attack on voting, I don't see, much that's going to stand in the way, because unfortunately, even if these cases go to the Supreme Court, you'll recall that John Roberts is not exactly a fan of the Voting Rights Act and has not been since he was a Reagan administration official. So my guess is there are 5 or 6 votes even on the Supreme Court to continue to undercut and undermine the right to vote. So this doesn't look great. And the data that Elon Musk has likely already swept up and has access to, everything from Social Security data to Treasury information data, they're already declaring people to be dead in order to remove their access to Social Security benefits. If you've been declared to be deceased, it's going to be very difficult if you're in an ID producing state or a state where you have to produce some proof of your existence for you to vote at all. So my guess is that the 2026 election is going to be very difficult. It's going to be a real challenge. And voting rights groups, the last thing I'll add, is that you now have the Trump administration using the IRS to go after 501c3s and C4s. And so you have a potential that the groups, many groups who actually assist people in getting access to the ballot, are going to also be under attack and fighting for their lives by 2026. So I always say, the data that we're seeing, including in this poll, shows, particularly among Hispanics, I'll echo what you said, Melissa, that 25% of Latinos approving of Donald Trump's job performance looks a lot like the traditional numbers for the way that Hispanics tend to vote. So if Hispanic Catholics are only at 25% and Hispanic Protestants are at 32%, that's starting to look more like the traditional Democratic lean of that electorate. But if they can't access the ballot, it doesn't really matter. So I'm very concerned about whether we'll have a free and fair election in 2026, let alone 2028.
So Joy mentioned concerns about access to the ballot and voting rights, and I would echo those. But I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind when it comes to Elon Musk and his team is the way that they've used this proximity to federal government data and federal government programs to raise questions, I think, in the mind, or at least try to raise questions in the minds of the public about the functionality and security of those systems. One of my colleagues, Stephen Fowler, reported a couple of weeks ago on the ways in which DOJ appears to have used Social Security data to advance a narrative about voter fraud that appears to be false, quite frankly, misleading claims about, for example, the idea that I think Joy mentioned dead people have Social Security numbers, or flagging the fact that immigrants have Social Security numbers, and sort of trying to mislead the public to think that that meant something was wrong when that's the way the system is set up. And so I think that, there's a lot of very often with Trump and his administration, there's a lot of smoke and a lot of misinformation and uncertainty around some of these ideas. Trump certainly in 2020 tried to raise questions in the mind of the public and outright deny the validity of the election. And I think you see a continuation of that approach with Elon Musk and his team. So he's using these claims, not only to lobby for cuts to Social Security, to sort of argue that something is amiss, something is awry, but also to undermine the election system itself and raise questions about its validity, which I think, could very well come back to haunt us in the future.
All right. Thank you both for that pretty insightful analysis. We have a question, actually, I want to throw to Robbie, that asked about whether do you think that the characteristic of ethnicity is a greater factor or faith when you pose questions to white Catholics or Hispanic Catholics, and we're looking at those results. And I think Robbie has written a lot about this topic. So Robbie, why don't you take that?
Yeah, well, it's notable that, we take it as kind of an artifact of that's just out there, that sociologists and political scientists sort the religious landscape by race and ethnicity. Like, we've always done that in the country, and the question is why. And so, this is the way, if you go to a doctoral program, this is the way you analyze. And the reason for that is history, right? That sociologists and political scientists want to describe things as they are lived out on the ground. All right. And so, famously, Martin Luther King said 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings, the most segregated hour, in the country. And frankly, that's largely still true. And so that reality sits in. And I think for people who are people of faith, I remember H. Richard Niebuhr, wrote this thing 100 years ago, where he called it a scandal, the color line in the Christian church. He called it a scandal. And, 100 years later, it's still part of the furniture, in the country. And so I think for people of faith, taking seriously that there are, for just example, there are no two groups that vote more opposite ways than white evangelical Protestants and African American Protestants, 2/3 of whom are also evangelical. And just let that sink in for a moment, right? We're so used to seeing those numbers, but if you step back and you kind of, put on your anthropologist from Mars hat and go, what is that about, right? You can see, the just amazing power of race that acts like a kind of prism, right? So the light kind of comes through it and it refracts it into these two very different political directions. And I think that's, in many ways, like, frankly, an indictment of, the way that our kind of religious institutions are structured, but very much a reality in which we're living in. The other place I'll mention, and we're talking about Pope Francis and this kind of Catholic moment where we're all thinking about Catholicism. The country today is nearing parity between white and Latino Catholics in the country. It's largely been an overwhelming white religious group, but it's a little more than 60-40 white Latino, and the Latino edge is growing, the white edge is shrinking. So we're getting close to parity there, and these groups are very, very different. And white Catholics supporting Trump every time he's been on the ballot, about 6 in 10. Latino Catholics voting at 2/3 the other way. And that is also race, ethnicity, right, running right through the middle of the church. So I would say, like, the just empirical data says that it looks like a lot of this is race trumping religion. That's the driving force here when it comes to politics, at least.
And do you mind if I add that to what Robbie said, and I highly recommend everyone read all of Robbie's books, because he really drills in on this in a really smart way. But right, I think people remember Bishop William Barber is an evangelical. Like, let that sit in. He is an evangelical Christian, and he is as opposite in every way to everything that white evangelicals believe. He centers his mission, as did Pope Francis, on the poor. It is his driving force. And that I will also note that Black evangelical Christians are actually quite conservative socially. It was very belated that they became open to LGBTQ rights. And the anti-trans messaging of Trump was a driver for some conservative African Americans to actually support Trump, to be more supportive of him, as was the economy. It was still a small number, but that was a driving factor. But if you go and you look at one of the divisions, and this is to come back to the poll, this question of whether discrimination against Christians and whites is as bad as discrimination against others, some of this among white evangelicals is a sense of personal persecution. Less than 4 in 10 of all Americans believe discrimination against Christians and whites, as Robbie laid out, is as bad as other groups. But 2/3 of white evangelicals agree with that. 2/3 of them. That's a big group. And so if you break out every other group of evangelicals, whether they're Latino or Black, they're not going to agree with that. And so I think part of it is a sense among white evangelicals, and Robbie can correct me if I'm wrong, but an ongoing sense of persecution that I think is intensifying as we get closer to that 2045 estimated date when white Americans actually cease to become the majority in the country. And I think there's an accelerating, what I call demographic panic among white evangelicals, and a desire to resort the country with white evangelical Christians at the top, and to keep them at the top. And there's a fear that they're losing that status.
I'll just add, I mean, Joy, you and I have talked about this a lot, but, it really is based on, not just sort of like looking at, the numbers or the grocery aisles changing and the elementary school portraits on the wall changing, and, it's and the radio dials and all that. But I really do think it is built on this larger underlying claim, which is an anti-democratic claim. And it is a claim that this country is of, by, and for white Christians, right? That's who the country's for. And you boil it down like that, I mean, I think that's really partly what's underlying this kind of, the great white Christian freakout moment that we've been experiencing. And even though that white number's out on the horizon when the country's going to be no longer majority white, we're already past the number of the country no longer being majority white and Christian. And I think it's that ethno-religious identity that's always been the marker. It's what's always kind of driven, is what drove the KKK. It's what driven the first America First movement, was all about white Christianity and white Protestant Christianity. So I think that's a big driver, here as well.
It's a feeling of a loss of cultural power. I mean,
yeah.
White evangelicals will point to a variety of issues where they feel discriminated against, whether it's, asking for conscience protections for healthcare providers who don't want to perform abortions or provide transgender care, or, pointing to prohibitions on prayer in schools. But I think it's also a larger, just a sense of cultural loss. And they'll point to the reality that, Hollywood and academia don't generally sort of align with the, white Christian conservative ideology. And so I think there's a sense that they've lost something that they once had, which you've documented really well, Robbie.
I think actually on that note, we're almost at the end of the hour. In fact, a lot of our questions were really about sort of white evangelical Protestants and how does their theology support someone like Trump doing things that pretty much go against the gospel and all of these sorts of things. So, but at this point, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us today. Joy, Sarah, always great to have you in our orbit. I think your comments were really helpful. Again, I strongly encourage folks to go look at our survey. We didn't even scratch the surface of some of our survey findings here. I'm also grateful that both Joy and Sarah really kind of dug into that data and kind of used those data points to really support their points. We're always grateful for good reporting, but good reporting that uses really good numbers is always the best, we think. So anyway, thank you both for joining us, and really thank you in the audience for joining us. Please go online, take a look at the survey.